Bhante. Can you hear me, Venerable Sir?
I can, yeah. How's it going?
Great.
Okay, fine, I made it.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah.
How's everything's going okay with your retreat so far?
Yeah, it is. Give you a little bit of a tour.
Oh, hey, everyone.
Yeah.
Jan is my co-teacher on this.
Okay.
And Jan
Hi,
is
how you
here.
going?
And there's more beings over that direction.
Ah, really? Ah, good.
So this is also, I don't know if you've been here, Bhante, but this is the classroom section of BCBS. And
Okay.
most of
I have
our,
not been there, no.
yeah, all of our activity has actually taken place in the Dhamma hall. So we've been meditating there, but this is where they've got the whole, you're on a projection screen up there and the whole thing, you know.
All right, so I'm all big, am I?
You're yeah.
What I've always
It's designed
wanted.
for remote Bhavatana.
Yeah. Yes, excellent. Yeah, good.
Yeah. So can I just give you a little context and then ask you a question, or?
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Perfect. I've already introduced you with a lot of honeyed words, many fine words. So if you want me to help you inflate a little, I can do it again.
Nice, thank you.
Okay,
can you
good.
just like summarize that again for me? No, I'm only kidding.
Yeah, the words wonderful, intelligent.
I am really only kidding. I'm really only kidding.
I know that, highly significant. Actually, I didn't use exactly those words, but you get the idea. Anyway, so we've been so far for several days, all day, every day.
Okay.
In outside the hall in noble silence, and in the hall, engaging this practice that I told you about briefly of Dharma contemplation. Yeah. And it has qualities of, say, Lectio Divina, the way you move through and meditate with a text, or qualities of the Jewish study of Hakuta, where you're together with people in coming to the Talmud. And it brings a lot of not just attentional energy, and sati can be very strong in the groups, but also the sense of all of us in it together. The group sizes have varied from 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 12, whole group.
Right.
And the practice begins in silence, and then we have two different Buddhas, two different people, read an excerpt of the text. Sometimes it's a whole sutta if it's short enough. Sometimes it's an excerpt. And so the senses of oral transmission, the voice of another, and wise attention in action, right? And so then we move through the text in these phases that touch just the words as such, as they begin to kind of get in your memory, and you just break habits of reading. And then the felt response, so you begin to get underneath the words into how it feels when you read them, and so on. And then into meaning, analytical, no holds barred, any kind of analysis is welcome. Cultural, sutta, textual, metaphors, and so on and so forth. And then kind of dropping that into Dhamma essences like natural law. What do you intuit in this of natural law, of what's universal? And finally, you put the text away entirely, and then kind of drop into the present moment. It's conditioned by the text, but you're no longer talking either about or even meditating with the text. You're with your spiritual friends. What's up? Like really, how are you feeling?
Sure.
What are you noticing? What's your experience?
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of beautiful moments. Sometimes, of course, the practice gets wonky. Sometimes it's very bright and quite reveals stunning things, even to seasoned folks, about the discourse. See what you didn't see before. And the theme of the practice has been spiritual friendship.
Right.
meaning that not of the form, but the content of the discourses has been completely gathered around Kalyanamitta.
Right.
The Megillah, the Upada Sutta,
Sure.
lots
Yeah.
of different. And so where I wanted to start, for then to just say, in contacting you and my profound gratitude for your saying yes, Bhante, is it would really help us to gain a deeper, more nuanced sense of, you might say, how reliable these texts are, where they come from, maybe have some understanding, however shallow, however preliminary, of the challenges of translation, getting something across 2,500 years, but even right now, you're in those challenges, I know.
Yeah.
And so what you could tell us about, like, can we rely on these? Do you feel a sense of lineage here that's been sustained? And then go from there where you want, and I'll ask a few questions if that's all right.
Sure. Okay, that all sounds great. Thanks so much, Gregory, for inviting me, and thanks to everybody there for coming along. I mean, first of all, let me say that I really appreciate what you're doing there and the approach that you're taking. And I think that what you're doing is like an essential complement to what I've been doing with sort of Central and with my translation work and so on, And unfortunately, advancing age has shown me that there are only a limited amount of hours in the day. And so sometimes we have to choose an area to focus on and to specialize. But, I'm so very aware of how important it is for the suttas. I can do the translation and so on, but that's just a dead letter. The important thing is, how do we bring that to life? And all of those things that you're talking about are so important there, particularly the role of community. I mean, if you think about how suttas were received, then in the vast majority of times it is in a group. And it's not an individual thing. Now, that's not my personal experience. Like my personal experience, I learned the suttas, for many years, just sitting in a kuti by myself. And that's it. And I had some books and things like that. And we would talk, the monks, I was in the monastery, and the monks would talk about it sometimes, but mostly it's a solitary practice. And we still see that a lot on the web today, like a lot of learning's being very fractured. And, we run a forum to try to promote that kind of discussion of suttas and so on. But it is really obvious when you see folks who come to the suttas just from that very kind of intellectual kind of way, without a kind of a sense for what it means within a community. And there's just a different way that you kind of hold that when you see that it's something that matters for people, and there's just a different perspective on it. So all of those things that you're talking about, and the way that you're bringing that sense of community and mindfulness and space to the suttas is really important. And this, of course, is all stuff which is drawn from the suttas ultimately, because the Buddha talked about, in quite some detail about the manner of listening to the suttas, I mean, some classic things the Buddha said: if you listen to the suttas with the uparambha citta, the fault-finding mind, then you're never going to understand it. At the same time, he said you should always inquire the meaning, right? So there's a middle ground between just blindly accepting everything and just being critical and cynical about everything. And so there's so many principles that the Buddha taught that are actually really useful for that. So you wanted to know something about, okay, you asked about a question about authenticity, and can we trust these things? Is that right?
Yeah, there's this, especially this blossoming in the last, however many, say 20, 30 years of the comparative linguistic, checking the discourses of, across different translations and so on, different ancient sources, Chinese and Pali and so on.
Yeah.
And a lot of people would say, held by memory for 100, 200, 300 years, and then translated and edited by bunch of old guys, So
Right.
what's left? And I just want to open up that skeptical thing and have you respond to it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I mean, for those, just to sort of briefly toot my own horn here, for those who want to go in more detail, you can check out a book that Brahmali and myself wrote a few years ago called The Authenticity of the Early Buddhist Texts. You can download that online, and it's available from the Oxford Centre for Buddhist Studies and the Buddhist Publication Society. So let me just talk about this kind of question of authenticity and the meaning of that question for a while. I mean, obviously, we have a collision between, I guess, tradition and modernity, or not necessarily a collision between them, but traditions stumbling into modernity. And we sort of come from a time when people would pretty much, if it's in a nice shiny cabinet on the shrine in the temple, therefore it must be what the Buddha taught, to sort of wanting a bit more sort of solid basis for things. So this process has been going on for quite some time. I think it's the first thing to acknowledge. So people have been looking into the historical authenticity of texts for 150, 200 years. In fact, the oldest, actually, you can trace it back more than like 2,000 years to the Deepa Wanks. Is probably the oldest text that really discusses the authenticity. In this, I think, 16th century Japan, there was a lot of discussion of these things. And so it's something which has come and gone through the tradition, but certainly got a lot of impetus in the 19th century. One of the reasons behind it was because for the first time in the 19th century, we were able to go to the places that are talked about in the suttas and dig stuff up. And, let's not forget how important this was, because otherwise these are just mythical places that are talked about. The Vulture's Peak in Rajagaha, this is like, what is it? It's like Narnia or something. And, you go there and, well, no, actually here it is. Oh, and there's a rock. It just looks like a vulture. And that's why it's called the Vulture's Peak. And so begin to realize that these things do have a meaningful historical background. Anyway, without wanting to go into it sort of too much, so the question arises as to the faithfulness of transmission. You mentioned about oral transmission. So this is something which sort of betrays very much a modern perspective, because we are very biased in terms of thinking of knowledge as being transmitted through the written word. But the reality is that there's no actual evidence that the oral transmission is any less reliable than written transmission. In fact, written transmission can be completely unreliable. And if you look at the history of the written transmissions of the Bible, or say Shakespeare, or even in modern times, someone like James Joyce or someone like that, then there's always a complex tradition of how that is edited and transmitted. So writing doesn't really guarantee anything. We know from the Rig Veda, if nothing else, that it is quite possible for the Indic tradition to pass down a work in the oral tradition for thousands of years without any changes. And there are specific technologies and practices that were developed in order to do this. So the whole thing of oral tradition versus written tradition is really a bit of a furphy. Do you know what furphy is? I think furphy is an Australian word. Do you know furphy?
I don't know.
No, furphy. Furphy is just basically a yarn that people spin to make a good tale about things. It doesn't.
Okay. Yeah.
Get where you're going. Where do you say a tall tale, perhaps?
Yeah.
Something
Okay.
like a tall tale or furphy.
Tall tale. Furty.
Furphy.
Furby.
Furphy.
Oh, Furby.
Furphy. Phy. Anyway, never mind. We got the message. So I'll try not to speak in too much Australian for you all. Okay, how are we going now? So yeah, it's misleading. It's a red herring. That's what I'm looking for. It's a red herring. What really matters in terms of transmission is how much care people take when they're doing the transmission. And look, this is same today with dealing with digital texts. I mean, I deal with sort of central and digital texts, and it's very easy to do a find and replace, and then whoops, suddenly 1,000 things have changed in the suttas. And why don't we do that? Well, because we take care. And of course, it's possible to change things, but do you or do you not? Now, one of the things that these people come from this skeptical point of view is talk about oral tradition. And one of the things to look for when you're trying to assess this kind of discourse is always ask yourself, what have these people actually contributed to understanding of this area? There's a big difference between somebody who comes along and says, this is a gotcha, so I can win the argument, and somebody who's actually done work in the field. And there's no one who's actually done work in the field who really questions whether text can be transmitted perfectly well orally.
Right.
So this thing tends to be used as a rhetorical gotcha, and it's not really a serious argument. Now, in terms of the reliability of transmission, one of the things that sort of Central is doing is we have identified a 14th century Pali manuscript, which is the oldest Pali manuscript in existence, more or less. And we're now creating a digital edition of this. Now, what that means is that we will be able to compare that edition with our modern editions. And we can then meaningfully, because then once you have that, that's not the whole Pali Canon, it's about 200,000 words. So when you have 200,000 words, you'll be able to meaningfully compare, well, this text with the one from 600 years ago and say, well, how much has changed? And then that will give us a sort of some solid basis on which to say, what kinds of changes were introduced. And so the real question there, the genuine historical question is to say, well, look, obviously things get changed. That's not even a question. The question is, well, how much do they change? What kinds of changes are introduced? And these are the things that sort of genuine scholars look into.
Right. And you began to talk about your translation process or generally the importance of translation as the next step in that transmission of the communication of the teachings. So like when you're working on your translation, because you're an active translator, you're of course checking how different words, what their provenance that about, and the language, you get more and more familiar. But you come upon knotty problems sometimes, like what does this
absolutely
mean? And yet here we are on the far end, the consumers of your work, and it's like, so we've been filtered through your mind in that sense. You've done this work, and you say, yeah, it's true, Bhante. So you better keep it right, So you choose a word like mendicants, some would say beggars, some say bhikkhus, or keywords like samadhi, I find untranslatable, or how people translate, tanha, or and so on. Kalyana. So those are really important decisions when on our end we're getting so intimate with the text. So could you talk about that process a little bit?
Okay, sure. All right, so take up one of the examples that you just mentioned. You mentioned the case of samadhi and whether it's translatable, and I agree, it's certainly one of the hardest words to translate. And just tell you a bit of a story about this, because I just finished my translations, right? And this was one of the ones I'd struggled with, and I'd corresponded with different people, psychologists, with Pali scholars, with people trying to figure out what's the best way of translating this. And after I finished this, I came back to Australia. I went to a conference, and just randomly at this conference, the opening session of the conference was in the evening, and I was put at the table next to this Aboriginal lady called Susan Moylan Coombs, and we sort of got along well, and we were chatting and so on, talking about meditation. And she mentioned, there are some words that Aboriginals have in their language that you can't translate into English. And I'm secretly saying to myself, yeah, sure. I mean, look, I've just spent spent 3 years doing translation, and look, you can pretty much translate anything, not necessarily elegantly. And then she said, you know, for example, in the Aboriginal languages, they have this word for like a state of the mind which is clear and open, and where the mind is just still and receptive to knowledge. And you just don't have a word like that in English. And I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, actually. So, Kabarananga, I believe it is, in one of the Aboriginal languages.
So that means you're
So-
translating the suttas into Aboriginal language now?
I would love to do that. I would love to do that. Yeah, I asked Susan if she'd do that. So far, we haven't found anyone. I mean, there are many Aboriginal languages, which is one of the problems. But absolutely, at least if we could do, there's some of the folks in Hawaii translated the Metta Sutta into Hawaiian. So that's really, really lovely, and we'd love to do, at least be able to translate the Metta Sutta into some of the Aboriginal languages would be great. Anyway, moving on. So samadhi, problem with samadhi, right? So concentration, not really great. I mean, it's serviceable, but it has too much of a doing feel to it. And, I'm going to sit, I'm going to concentrate on things. And I always think that concentration is it's like when you're sort of, you have to make yourself pay attention to something that's intrinsically boring. Like you're sitting at the back of the class and it's like, oh, drifting. You say, well, concentrate. And so that kind of doesn't quite work. Now, okay, so we can keep the word samadhi there. The problem with that, though, is that Pali is not really a dead language. Actually, it's also a living language. And the word samadhi means different things in different places. If I'm in Thailand, samadhi is commonly used as a word to meditate.
Wow.
So if I say I'm going to go and sit samadhi in Thai, by Nang Samadhi, it just means I'm going to go and meditate. It doesn't mean I'm going to go and sit in some deep attainment of meditation. Right? In say the Vipassana movements, they use words like Kanika Samadhi and Upachara Samadhi, which is talking about states of states of stillness or states of clarity, but still a bit different from like the suttas. It's mostly restricted to jhanas or to those deeper states of samadhi. So even within that tradition, it's not completely different, but it's also not completely the same.
Right.
Or another example, in the Indian tradition, in the Hindu tradition, samadhi often means the death of a realized being.
Wow.
Right? So if you keep the word samadhi, you're not preserving meaning. You're saying that all these different people in different places are going to read that word. Another great one is bodhisattva. Right? Bodhisattva, Google it. It says bodhisattva is somebody who sets aside their own enlightenment for the sake of helping others, which of course is absolutely the meaning that it has in later forms of Buddhism. But in the suttas, it means the exact opposite. In the suttas, bodhisattva is almost only used for Siddhartha when he's left home and he's seeking his own enlightenment. And actually it's quite a different, so if we use bodhisattva there, it conveys quite the wrong impression. So keeping things in the original language, I think, is another red herring or another furphy, if you will. And it doesn't necessarily really help to preserve meaning. So when I started my translation, one of my thoughts was, it's a translation, put everything in English. Really, I think Brahman was one of the few words I didn't keep I didn't translate. We don't really have anything comparable. So very few, but most things I try to translate. And it's always imperfect, but you do your best. Now, one of the principles that I used, which is a kind of a counterintuitive principle, is I call it the principle of least meaning. Right, the principle of least meaning. And actually, I got this idea from some discussions of biblical translations. And the idea behind the principle of least meaning is that religious texts tend to accrue meaning over time in the terms of commentaries, discussions, cultural connotations, and they just get overloaded. And you constantly find things that have a simple and plain meaning in the early texts that are then construed in all of these different ways, right? And that's not to say that you shouldn't do that, right? I mean, that's part of what a tradition is. You know, it takes those original teachings and it plays and applies them in different ways. You know, that's the spiritual creativity. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we're reading the actual original texts, we want to try to listen to what they're saying and not trying to impose on them philosophies and perspectives and so on. So this is why to translate with the least meaning means to come back to the most simple, plain, concrete meaning of any particular passage, rather than trying to necessarily capture every philosophical nuance with them. I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So for example, an important one is the translation of metta. Now, metta, we always translate it as loving kindness. Absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with that translation, except it's not really an English word. It's a Buddhist hybrid English word.
Right.
We just made it up. And there are good doctrinal reasons for that, because, you know, it's meant to distinguish that this means, you know, benevolent thoughts, but not associated with sexual desire and attachment. Okay, so there's a perfectly good reason for that. But at the same time, you lose something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's a distancing language. It's not how people talk to each other. They don't say, I feel loving kindness for you. They say, I love you. And love is the word in the English language that we use for that. And so this is why for metta, I just use love rather than using loving kindness. It's more emotionally powerful and connecting. I'll just tell you one more example of this my approach to translation. This one I just found recently. Some of you may be familiar with the book in the Sutta Nipata. The last chapter of the Sutta Nipata is called the Parayanavagga. You're familiar with the Parayanavagga? Hopefully. Good. So Parayanavagga, beautiful chapter. Yeah? So where 16 Brahmins go on this great journey to see the Buddha, and then they ask him all of these questions. Now, the Parayanavagga is usually being translated as the way to the beyond. And that's how I translated it as well. Lovely title, right? Parayana, the para is the beyond, Parayana, the way to the beyond. Lovely title, right? Nothing wrong with it. Now, para can mean the beyond, or it can mean, in a more concrete sense, the far shore. All right?
Right.
Both perfectly correct. It's not a matter of being correct or incorrect. So a lot of times when people think about translation, they think, oh, is this correct or incorrect? But the more interesting things are to think about the connotations of them. Now, I always translated as the way to the beyond. I never thought about it too much. And just now, I memorized this 25 years ago. And I've been chanting it and reciting it and studying it and teaching on it and translating it. It was only a couple of weeks ago that I started to notice what this really meant. So in the beginning of that whole chapter, it says that this Brahman Bhavari settled by the banks of the Godavari River. Now, I didn't think too much about that. Right? Godavari River? What's that? Okay, so there's plenty of rivers in India. I looked it up on Wikipedia. So thank you to Wikipedia. And it's the second biggest river in India. The Dakina Ganga, they call it. The Ganges of the South. And it's got biggest floodplain of any river in India. Yeah? And so all of these Brahman rishis are in their little ashram on the side of this mighty gushing river that is prone to floods. And if you look through their questions, they come back to the fear of floods and the seeking of the far shore again and again and again, not just once or twice. I counted like 14 mentions in those chapters.
Yeah.
It's like the fundamental expression of dukkha for them is the being in the flood and the rising of the flood. And this has made this impression, which has been perhaps just subconsciously expressed through all of these things. And then the Buddha's teaching is like leading from one shore to the next. Yeah? And so from there, you realize, oh, actually, it should be the way to the far shore. not the way to the beyond.
Yeah.
It's more concrete, it's more specific.
Right. Now,
Yeah.
as you're saying that, I was going to
Yeah.
just offer you a sense of Dharma contemplation. If we're, let's say, in the second phase where we're talking about the felt response to the words,
Right.
and not looking at the whole of the sutta, just the words, right?
Yeah.
And for me to say the way to the beyond, and it's, I get this sense of vast but untouchable, impossible,
Right.
touch the far shore. And as you say, it's concrete. Oh, the far shore. That's
right.
That could be, and as they say, and that could be for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you're getting, it's only, in a way, it's only a small thing. It's not wrong to say it's a way to the beyond, but it's just those countless little details that we try to build up that will establish, a sense of the lived reality, to make it sound like, these are human beings, and not just sort of archetypes. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's if anything, maybe, Bhante, that's the heart of maybe this conversation is what this, how the text can carry the whatever you want to call that message, the Dhamma, from human being, like the Buddha was a human being, the other, people in it were human beings, to me and us as human beings. And so how the language can do that, and we can receive something that is liberating, basically. It's quite a task that text carries, right? It's trying to carry the Dhamma.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I have a question about that also. So one of the things that we do sometimes.
Sorry to interrupt, Gregory. So just make a passing comment.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to link that with the previous question on authenticity. All right. One of the basic arguments which Brahmali and I made was that authenticity of text is not something that you can prove by having a single piece of evidence. It's not like we've got one book from 2,500 years ago and we can point to and say this is what the suttas have. But it's because of a countless array of individual points, none of which themselves is decisive, but which taken together paint a compelling picture. And this thing with the Godavari River is just another one of those little points of detail, because it's mentioned in passing in the narrative, and then it's expressed in the subconscious through the fears of those monks.
Right.
And that's something which it has that kind of ring of authenticity. Like if I was from Australia, I'd probably be going to the Buddha and saying, it's as if I'm surrounded by a great fire and conflagration. How do I put out these fires that are all around me,
Right.
And although we've also been having floods as well, but it's that kind of imminent wisdom or lived reality which is passed through the suttas that to me is most interesting.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And
please continue. Sorry, where you were, Greg.
Yeah. So one of the interesting areas of inquiry for us, and one of the challenges, sometimes we'll be working with an entire sutta, especially when they're nice and short, like something from the Anguttara 2s or 3s or something.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'll work with an excerpt, because, if you're with the Parinibbana Sutta, and if you're with the Parinibbana Sutta and it's, like, I don't know how many words that is, but really long.
A lot, yeah.
Yeah, you can't read that over and over and over and over and over again, and so we take a piece of it.
Of course, just much or large bits of the Anguttara are in fact excerpts from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so I guess I wonder about. I don't say I feel guilty about excerpting, but sometimes it runs into difficulties, like you lose context or something like that. Do you, I'm sure that you've seen lots of suttas excerpted and your translations used in different ways.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any comments on just that process of extracting the
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Do I want to hear them?
No, look, it has to happen. And like I said, it's in the suttas themselves. I mean, the Anguttara 1s and 2s are probably largely, if not totally, composed of excerpted suttas. Actually, Rod Bucknell, my friend up in Queensland, sort of did an analysis of this and actually showed a lot of the suttas that these things have been taken from. So yeah, there has been that process since the very earliest times. Things have been cut up, rearranged, put in together. And of course, the Buddha himself was doing that, right? He would repeat the same teachings in different contexts and so on. So nothing wrong with that. But I think there's a few things which I think we can guard against. First thing is that I think, personally, I think we should guard against like having an entirely abstracted notion of what Dhamma is. And this is a process that you see through the Abhidhamma traditions and so on, where you say this is what the Buddha taught, and he taught the Four Noble Truths, and he taught the Eightfold Noble Path, and he taught these kinds of things, which of course is all true, but it's not quite like that, you know, because what the Buddha did was respond to a person who was in suffering, and he didn't just doctrine Buddhism at them. You know, he empathized with where they were at and tried to lead them onwards. And there's been some discussion about this recently in our forum, people pointing out that a lot of the major doctrines, like dependent origination or the five aggregates and so on, like say in the Digha Nikaya, you rarely encounter these things. You know, you have lots of other things. And I think what part of the thing that's showing us is that, you know, you can't really reduce the Buddha's teachings just to these doctrines. The doctrines are important, of course, but the manner in which they're taught and the context is what really gives that meaning. Yeah, so this is one thing that's important for me. And when excerpting, I'll just try to think of some examples. Always prefer to use concrete examples. Okay, so go on. Do you have an example in mind?
Well, I was going to say that, for example, we just read a Megillah Sutta, and it's so clear that the context is one of the most powerful things. The story where Megillah is going off and wants to go off on his own, and then he comes back and has total failure, and then the Buddha speaks to him. So I can tell you from this group right here that some of the takeaways were, well, he wasn't ready to get that before. He wasn't really ready to receive that wisdom before. The Buddha had this wisdom, this compassion to see what was ready, but also the sense of relationship with him. And then you go into these 5 things, you know, spiritual friendship is you know, sets the whole path in motion. Let me tell you how. So even though it's, you know, could be excerpted, and we're going to work with an excerpted version too to see what that's like, those contexts really are important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you know, great example. I mean, you know, I look at that and I think you're with the Buddha, and he says, you know, maybe good idea not to do that, and you go and do it. And I'm like, okay,
dude.
Very inspiring for Dhamma teachers, right? Because you know that happened to the Buddha as well. They'll just completely ignore your advice, go and do their own thing. But you know, and you know, we laugh, but that shows a healthy teacher-student relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah. The Buddha was not insisting, he was not demanding, he was not punishing, he was trying to help. He wanted to eventually, okay, you go do your own thing, you find out. Sometimes that's how you learn, you know, and it really is that healthy relationship. So I'm just trying to think of an example of something that's commonly excerpted out of its context.
What's that?
Can you think of anyone that could come up for you?
Jan was just suggesting, when you see me, you see that. When you see me, you see the Dhamma. When you see the Dhamma, you see me. And that's often taken out of context. Just that it's like a one-liner, right?
Yeah.
Goes from a discourse to a one-liner.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that became quite, I think, I'm not sure all of the history, but I think it became quite philosophically important in the Mahayana traditions, right? That became became connected with this sense of like a longing to have some connection with the Buddha and with the person of the Buddha. So again, I think like a good example of where something which is quite a simple statement in the earliest text then becomes laden more and more with meaning as time goes on. And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with those meanings. It's just a matter of just understanding in context, like what it is that the Buddha was really talking about. And from there we can then understand. And I think this is really important for for those of us who are interested in the early texts. It's not a matter of saying that early Buddhism is right and everything else is wrong. It's a matter of saying, well, let's base our spiritual practice on the truth, on the reality, and let's approach that with a sense of empathy. And like a lot of the more reductive and critical approaches to reading texts, I really lack that sense of empathy, of not trying to pick holes in things, but trying to understand where are people coming from, why are they like that,
Oh, that's beautiful.
and honestly, I first picked up on this. Actually, first really was identified with this. There was a book years ago with the Dalai Lama in conversation. He was invited to give a talk at a Christian group. And that was quite a famous book. That was about 20-something years ago. And he was invited to comment on some Bible passages. And of course, he gave a really interesting commentary on them. And then some people responded. And one of the respondents said to him that, he really noticed how compassionately that His Holiness handled those pieces of scripture. And he said, well, he's obviously very intelligent, and if he wanted to take them apart and criticize them, then he could have done, but he chose to approach them from that empathetic perspective. And that's something that's really informed my approach since then. We need to have maintained a critical mind, but at the same time, if that is just driving things too much, you end up with something that's just nihilistic and arid, and you forget what is the point of all this.
Right.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I have another question. One of the challenges we run into is the gendered pronouns in the early discourses. And when you're dropping into these texts and it says he this and he that over and over and over, and it's, let's say, 80% women who are reading those words. So how do you have any thoughts on altering the pronouns in excerpts for Dharma Contemplation?
Well, in my translations, I don't use gendered pronouns unless they're demanded by the context.
So, I mean, you have the situation frequently where the Buddha is speaking to a group of monks. And so you can say, well, obviously, the situation historically, these were male hearers, and the word he is appropriate and, let's say, true. On the other hand, it's still the case that it's speaking universally to the human being.
But no, I don't agree that first statement is true. Actually, this is why I translated bhikkhu as mendicant, because it's a gender-neutral translation.
Yeah.
In fact, in the audience would have been bhikkhus and bhikkhunis a lot of the time. Now, we can't say how much of the time, but there are a number of cases that show that this is the case. Actually, I think both Venerable Analayo and Venerable Ananda Jyoti have written articles about this. And you also have cases, for example, where, say, the Pali Sutta, I'm just thinking of the Pali Satipatthana Sutta, is addressed to the bhikkhus, but the Chinese version of that, or a Chinese version of that, is addressed to bhikkhus and bhikkhunis.
Right.
So I believe that the word bhikkhu in the suttas, by default, is a gender-neutral term that is used for both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis.
Yeah.
So that's why I've translated it as mendicants.
Mendicant.
And all the way through, I've used they, them pronouns. So I've translated everything in the sutta with they, them pronouns, except where the gender is specified, or where it is contextually sort of meaningful. So you might have, for example, a case where, I don't know, it might not actually specify the gender, but it might be a case where it's a gendered context. So it might talk about making a livelihood as a warrior or something like that.
Right.
And so we know historically that would have been addressed to a male audience or something like that. That's just an example. But so generally speaking, I use they, them pronouns and gender neutral terminology by default, and only use gendered terminology when it's required by the text.
Right, right. Let me ask another question, and then I'm going to see if there are questions. Let me ask another question, then I'm going to see if there's any, like either Jan, if you have something specific, or if there's other questions here, and if not, that's fine, because Bhante and I can go on and on talking. But it's you can only answer only as much as you care to, Bhante, because it's you might say it's a direct question to you as a human being, not not as abstract translator guy. So for your own sort of inner work of the path, I'm speaking to you as a human being. How has it been moved, impacted, shaped by your immersion in the text this way? The actuality, the living quality of it. Not a job, not an interesting thing, but this life.
Sure, yeah. Well, honestly, hard to say, because I've been living with these texts for so long. I'm kind of trying to remember a time beforehand. I can remember, I remember one of the things I do remember about, when, I first did meditation. Like many people, you come to meditation. I was more interested, wasn't really that interested in Buddhism, just wanted to see what meditation was about. And then just that encounter with the suttas was something that really struck me from the beginning. And I read a few Dhamma books, and I was like, oh, okay, all right. And then I read the suttas, and I felt like it really spoke to me. So it's been something that's really sort of called me from that time. I think, okay, so if I was to look at some specific things in terms of how it's affected me, yeah. Well, one of the things I think is about learning from the way that the Buddha related to people and his openness when talking with people, but also his maintenance, his kind of fearlessness in maintaining his own perspective. Like he wasn't just agreeing with people all the time because he was afraid of disagreeing with them. So I try to keep that when I'm having discussions with people, and to maintain my own perspective, maintain my own strength. And that came very useful, especially with the bhikkhuni ordination. That became a really time for me when it challenged the authority of the teachers versus listening to what the suttas are saying, or listening to what the Buddha was saying. And that was like a massive psychic split for me at the time. I went whole nights when I wouldn't sleep, because the energy was just kind of coming up. It was just like this thing where you're just, something inside you is really changing.
Oh wow, yeah.
And you feel like these things are very hard to put into words.
They are.
But you feel like you're coming into. You're feeling like you have the maturity and the confidence to come into who you've already been, or who you've always wanted to be, and that sense that the Buddha brings of how do I kind of put it? How do I put it? that sense that the Buddha brings of this almost relentless balance and evenness in how he responds to people and deals with things, always with that sense of empathy, but never getting ruffled, never reacting out of things, never being judgmental about people. This is something that I always sort of try to bring with things as well. Okay, I'll just give you another example of that. In recent years, there's been a few people have written, I'm sure some of the people there be familiar, about Buddhism and the ethics of war.
Right.
And Bhikkhu Bodhi wrote an article, and Tanisaro wrote an article in response,
Right.
and there's a bit of back and forth and so on.
Yeah, I've been following
And
it.
one of the, yeah, so I recently wrote an article on the same topic, and went back and revisited one of the suttas about that, where the Buddha talks to a warrior. And when people have talked about that, they always say the Buddha talked to this warrior, and he said, if you go into battle and you go and kill and hate and everything, then when you die, you're going to go to hell. Okay, so that's that. But what people have sort of left out about that, or what's easy to miss, is that the Buddha didn't even want to say anything to this warrior.
Right.
3 times the warrior's asking him. And I mean, look, this is a warrior, right? He's not a snowflake, right? He's someone who's been out there battling and everything. And the Buddha's still so concerned for his emotional well-being that he doesn't want to tell him the bad news. And then he says, yeah, when he tells him, and he bursts into tears, and the Buddha said, yeah, well, this is why I didn't want to say anything. And that sense of that humility and reservation about one's own beliefs and views and ideas is something that I've found myself having to sort of check and try to develop as I get older and as I get more, hopefully more wise. That ability to just see that words have an effect and they have a meaning, rather than just something that sounds plausible in your in your thoughts.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That's inspiring, Barre. Thank you. Yeah. Let me just check the room here for the minute.
Yeah.
Either Jan, you, or does anybody have something they want to bring forward? If not, I could keep it going. Oh yeah, okay. And try to be concise, brief.
We have a few more minutes, 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I recently heard something very meaningful.
So I think the microphone's not switched on. I can't hear.
Mine will not work.
Can
Oh,
you
at
hear
least I
that?
can't hear.
Oh, yeah.
Not really.
Come to
Maybe
You have to come up here.
maybe you can come forward and I can hear you through the computer. That would be nicer. Then I can see you too.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, use both.
I can.
Okay. What I wanted to say is I heard something that was quite meaningful to me, and I wonder how you feel about it in relation to reading text and working with text. That when we read a text intimately and be with it the way we're being with it, that we are changed, but also is the text is changed.
Right.
Charles Hallisey speaks about that, the aliveness of a text, that it will always be now different because we have worked with it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. Like a text in the sense of meaning is an interaction. Otherwise it's just a bunch of, paper sitting on a library shelf. So a text to be meaningful has to be picked up and open the page and interact with it. And then that changes it. It changes it in concrete ways, because the discussions around text will then influence how people talk about it, how they respond to it, how they translate it. And, it's something I try to be aware of when I'm translating. It's not just what does the text mean, but also how it's going to be received, what kinds of, responses and so on are going to be, you can't you can't deal with all of that, but you at least try to be aware of it. But yeah, very much so. So the text only exists in a meaningful sense when it's being read and when it's actually coming alive in people's minds. Yeah. Can I just interject like one of my pet theories here? One of my pet theories is that this is the historical distinction between the Theravada and Sarvastivada, two of the early schools of Buddhism. The Theravada school says that only the present moment is real and the past and the future don't exist, right? This is basic Theravada doctrine. And the Sarvastivadins say that things always exist, but they're only active in the present. That's one of the philosophical distinctions. But it always strikes me that that distinction is precisely the difference between an oral text and a written text. In an oral text, it's not there until you recite it. And then you say that word and it's there, and then it's not there anymore. But with a written text, somehow they're always there. The manuscript is there, and all the words are always existing there.
Yeah.
But they don't kind of come active until you read it.
Right.
And then they come alive.
Right. So you're like a read head moving through the file.
Yes. Yeah.
Jan had a comment or question. Take both.
Okay.
Jan.
This is
How's it
really
going, Jan?
important. I'm Jan. Hi. Modern issues and seeking in the text for issues like climate change and emergency,
Right.
and reading old text and some of the new challenges. I'd just like to hear, particularly around that, your thoughts on that.
Ah, blimey.
Let's go big.
Okay, well, look, as it happens, after this session's finished, I have another session in an hour or two with the CSIRO, it's Australia's premier scientific body, and who, by the way, invented Wi-Fi. So CSIRO has a long history of inventing things and then doing nothing with them, and then somebody else takes them and makes billions of dollars with them. So anyway, but yeah, the scientists at CSIRO are all freaking out because of climate change, and they've been telling people about this for years, decades, and no one's doing anything. And the way that they've been treated in the organization is shocking, you know, especially under our previous government. In 2016, they got to work and just had an email that said that climate change was no longer going to be a priority for them. And yes, so this came from the political masters who were, you know, one of the most denialist governments in the world. So we have a new government now. Hopefully things will be a bit better, although not that much better, unfortunately. So yes, the scientists are all freaking out. So we're trying to do we've been doing a course for like a year or something, where we do sessions with the scientists and the staff and try to build resilience and build mindfulness, and to be able to cope with these things. At the moment, we're working with Subhana Bajagi, who's one of our local Zen teachers. So yeah, climate change.
And in relationship, Jan, to the discourses, and you were
Yes.
saying people are pulling things out of the discourses and interpreting, or?
Yeah, well, that's one problem, but it's also, you know, how do you work with modern things and ancient?
Okay.
In the Buddha, they threw water. They took. They could have an environmental consciousness for sure.
Yeah. Well, look. Okay. So in that case of climate, let's take climate change specifically as an example. So and how we relate to that in text. Now, the first thing is that, are there texts in the suttas that talk about climate change? Yes, obviously there are. So that's interesting, right? That is not just something that we've just realized now, but 2,500 years ago, the Buddha talked about it. He actually talked about it a number of times and talked about how the planet would grow and everything would come to an end and all of those kinds of things. Now, so that big perspective on time is very much there. So that's useful just to know that and to see that. It's also useful because there's a certain tendency among Buddhists to say, oh, I'm just going to meditate and I'm not going to worry about those things. You say, well, the Buddha was talking about them, then hopefully that might make people sort of pay attention. So that's one thing. Second thing is, how did the Buddha talk about them? Well, first thing is that the Buddha said that climate change was anthropogenic. So in the Aganya Sutta, he's talking about how human actions change the climate.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is not It's 2,500 years ago. Through agriculture, through land clearing, all of these kinds of things, you're changing the way that the climate is. And in fact, it's a traditional Buddhist belief that, you know, I find this fascinating. It's traditional Buddhist belief that if you have a righteous ruler, then the rains will fall in season and the crops will be fertile. And probably up to a decade or so ago, people would have thought, oh, that's just superstition.
Quite clear.
And now we're like, oh yeah, maybe there is something to this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So these kinds of knowledge are there, you know. So we know that, and the Buddha, and the other thing that Buddha talked about is how these things are conditioned. So that's obviously part of dependent origination and so on. So in other words, that you know, it's something that we as participants in that cycle are a part of, you know, rather than being, you know, it's not just an impersonal process that we can't affect or we can't change, nor is it something that's decreed by God or anything like that, but it's a process in which we are participants. So all of these things are things that we can establish from the text. Now, of course, what we can't establish from the text are like the specifics of the scientific details, the levels of CO2, particular strategies, and all of those kinds of things. So there's certainly room for a range of perspectives in terms of how serious people think it is, what kinds of responses we think are appropriate. You know, at what point do we run around with our hair on fire screaming, we're all doomed, we're all going to die? And so, you know, these things are, you know, people are going to have their different responses to those things. So then apart from the things dealing with climate specifically, then we have, of course, the range of teachings and practices which deal with emotional reactivity, particularly with meditation, developing metta, developing compassion, developing equanimity, and all of these kinds of reflections. So we have that principle that the Buddha taught, which is that you're not going to learn to cope with it just by turning away from it. You know, the Buddha was turn to it and understand it, because turning away from it is an expression of fear. So that's also, I think, thing which we can learn from these. There's another thing which I think we can learn from Buddhism, is that not modern discourse on climate change and responses to climate change. People are like, oh, don't be too doomerist, you'll fall into despair. But despair is actually like fine and natural and normal. You know, the Bodhisattva fell into despair before he left his home. We wouldn't have a Buddha if he hadn't fallen into despair. It's a normal part of a process, and you're going to go through it. And if your thing is to say, well, I don't want to feel that, then you're probably going to be content with the, you know, basically patching, you know, low-level patching and coping, which of course there's nothing wrong with that, right? Nothing wrong with coping, but it has limits. Right. And likelihood is at a certain day, then that's going to come crashing down. So much better to turn towards it and to recognize that sometimes, yeah, you're going to feel grief. Sometimes you're going to be in tears. Sometimes you're going to feel despair, you know, and that also is impermanent, and that's part of the process. So, yeah, you know, keep on going. I wrote an article about it called "I'd Rather Be a Doomer Than a Boomer." Yeah.
That's actually really beautiful, Bhante. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I see that our hour is, you know, our hour.
Yeah.
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 So let me just share with you that, you know, kind of personal statement, I guess, that my sense, my relationship with the teachings is such that I don't take any of them as some sort of theory about life. I take all of them as practices. Right. You know, if the Buddha saying something that seems abstract, like about the khandhas, the aggregates, then right. I'm taking that as this is what you practice. Or if he says, if you have something in the discourses that's about let's say these, this seeing the relationship between Moggallana and Sariputta, that's a practice
Okay.
that indicates
Sure,
something.
yeah.
So it's with sincere and deep gratitude that I want to thank you for what you do, because you're part of guiding the practices that I both undertake and teach through through laying that work out there.
Yeah.
So it's no small thing. I'm really meaning it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's really nice to hear.
Yeah.
And thank you for all the work that you're doing and for all the work that the people there are doing. And just let me just say that we are in challenging times. And congratulations on the midterms, by the way. Seem to have staved off the arising of fascism for at least a little couple of years. Anyway, but each one of you plays a role in this, a big role or a small, to keep that sense of calm. And if other people are panicking, to keep a sense of calm. When other people get caught up in crises of the moment, just to keep that longer term perspective. And to just remember that sense of meaning and purpose in humanity that is underlying all of these things, why it matters and why it's valuable. And if you remember why, human life is valuable and precious, then that can be something that can help to sustain you. And not just sustain you, but to sustain all the people around you. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And I'd say, like, people around you, and especially the ones you don't even need necessarily notice. So I'm not just talking about like explicit mentoring or something like that, but I'm just saying that just the way that you bear yourself among these things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Bhante, Sukhi Hotu. May the benefits of your generosity follow you from life to life.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thanks so much, Greg. Thanks, everybody. Have a great retreat.
I'll catch you again, Bhante.
Yeah, okay. See you. Bye. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
There are.